Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from Los Angeles, California. Today the weather here is a bit cool. It rained most of the night, most of the morning, and it's gonna rain again in a bit, so that may happen during this broadcast, and if so, we'll just keep on going. How's everybody doing today? You having fun? You taking care of yourself? You staying safe? You being happy? I hope so. Today is going to be a little different than the other critter chats that we've had because we're going to start from a different spot. I figured that since this is our 3rd week anniversary of Critter Chat, we're going to now go a little bit further into the world of what could be, should be, or maybe what once was. We're going to talk today about unicorns, and we're going to hopefully explore some of the different legends and myths and discover maybe where those stories started and hopefully learn a few things along the way. So in addition to being a zoo nerd, I'm also a geography nerd, and I'm very intrigued by how people live on the planet, how people interact with each other, and how that has happened historically. So things like legends and myths have always intrigued me, especially when we can look back and kind of put all the pieces together. And that's what I've tried to do with Critter Chat today in talking about unicorns. So hope you're ready to explore, learn, discover, and have some fun. So to begin with, let's talk a little bit about some of the legends or myths surrounding this magical, fantastical beast, the unicorn. Legends date back to primitive civilizations in the Indus Valley in India and Mesopotamia. So that's in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria. And some of those legends and early artwork depict either a horse-like or goat-like animal with a single horn. And that really is kind of the jumping off point for many of the legends of a unicorn. Now, some of these also kind of compare with a similar legend that started on the other side of the world from those areas in China and Japan. And they also had this story of this mystical creature with one horn, and it looked somewhat similar. And I have some photos of some different artworks from those time frames that I'll share later today. Now, after those civilizations came what we begin the historically we call the birth of modern civilization with the Greeks. Now, the Greeks didn't talk about unicorns in a myth way. They talked about a lot of things in mythology, but unicorns, they actually talked about in a natural history sort of way. They talked about them as if they were real. Now, why would that be? Several different Greek philosophers tried to describe unicorns. They tried to say where they lived, how they acted, and it kind of became kind of this other part of the legend that aside from being white, horse-like, or goat-like animals with a single horn, they were also shy and very rare and had some magical healing powers and difficult to catch or to tame. And so through the history, these stories kept being told of this fantastical beast with this single horn and its magical properties. And we moved on through history, retelling that story, recreating images based on that story, with few people ever seeing what they thought would be a unicorn. Until the medieval times, and then into the Renaissance after that, with an early explorer you may have heard of named Marco Polo. Marco Polo is famous for discovering an overland trade route that went from Europe to Asia called the Spice Road. And through that area, he was able to explore and discover ways to get over to Asia, and they would trade a lot of goods, mostly spices, some fabrics. The Silk Road is also what it's sometimes referred to. And through his explorations, he came across a beast he called a unicorn. And his description is pretty interesting, so I'm gonna read it to you. He said that they are scarcely smaller than elephants, with hair like a buffalo and feet like an elephant. And they further said that they have a single large black horn in the middle of their forehead with a head like a wild boar, and they spend a lot of their time by wallowing in the mud or slime. He also said they are very ugly brutes and not at all as we have described them. Now that's kind of an interesting description of what a unicorn is. That's very different than a lot of the images that we have thought of or heard of. What type of animal do you think Marco Polo would have been describing as he traveled across Central Asia and was looking for a new trade route? To further our legend story, the King of Denmark commissioned a new throne to be built for his palace. And his throne was something pretty impressive. I have a great photo of it I'll share later. His throne is made of unicorn horns. How did he get those? Is this animal real? What could he have gotten them from? Pretty interesting stuff. But to recap those legends and stories, we know that it's a white, horse-like or goat-like animal with a single horn. It's shy, it's rare, it has magical healing properties, and it's difficult to catch or tame. So there's a lot of different theories of where these legends and myths came from. Why were we talking about unicorns? Why did we ever go down this crazy trail? Well, there's actually multiple sources, in my opinion. We're going to talk about those. There's some real animals that help inspire these myths, and we're going to go through 4 different major ones, and I'll share more pictures of them later on so you can see where these myths came from. I'll be sharing those later on Facebook, and hopefully I'll be able to get them up on Instagram as well. So first off, I'm going to jump back to that description by Marco Polo. A large animal slightly smaller than an elephant with big feet wallowing in mud, big ugly brutes. What would that animal have been? That's clearly a rhinoceros, right? A rhinoceros, if we remember from our chat about rhinos early on in Critter Chat, rhinos are related to horses. That's actually one of their closest relatives. So claiming that a rhino is kind of like a horse isn't far off from a scientific perspective. They also have a single horn in the middle of their forehead. That's kind of goes along with the legend and the myth. And many people believe that rhino horns have magical healing properties. That's one of the big reasons that they're so endangered today, is that they were poached and hunted for those horns. And rhinos live across that area in northern India, which is also one of the birthplaces for this legend about a unicorn. Now there's 2 species of rhinos that live in Asia that only have 1 horn. There's another species in Asia that has 2 horns, and both the African species have 2 horns as well. But in Asia, the greater one-horned rhino lives in northern India and Nepal, and it very well matches the description of Marco Polo's unicorn. Now there's a smaller rhino called the Javan rhino that looks pretty much like the big one. It's just smaller in size, and it lives throughout the forest of Southeast Asia. Today it's limited to just the island of Java, but not that long ago it also lived in Vietnam and along those forests of the Malay Peninsula. So that would be Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia. So rhinos are definitely a good option for where the unicorn came from. But it doesn't always match the artwork, right? So maybe there's some other animals out there that also could be origins of this unicorn myth. And for that, I present to you some animals called the oryx. Now, oryx are fascinating animals. They are very well-developed antelope species that live in very extreme climates in Africa and the Middle East. There are four main species of oryx: the gemsbuck, who lives in southern Africa; the fringe-eared or Besset oryx, they live in eastern Africa. I've actually seen those in the wild in Kenya. And then the other two species are further north. One is called the scimitar horned oryx, and that lived in the Sahara Desert in northern Africa. And the other is the Arabian oryx that lives on the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East. That's where the other legend of the unicorn started, is Mesopotamia. And the Arabian oryx is an animal that we worked with at the Phoenix Zoo when I worked there. And the Phoenix Zoo actually has a very long history of working with that animal. And that's because the Arabian oryx, it's kind of an amazing special creature. So it was common throughout the Middle East and even into parts of Africa, maybe into Egypt, throughout most of its life or history on Earth. And it was very revered by the people who lived in that area. They felt that it was very important and almost a spiritual or sacred experience to be able to hunt an oryx. Now, at that time, they were hunting with very primitive weapons, so things like a bow and arrow or a spear. And to get close to an oryx, you have to be a very skilled hunter. So you would have to sneak up on it, and you would have to be very quiet because they have really big ears with good hearing, and they're really fast, even across the desert sand. And they often would see them from far away, standing on a hillside. And as they'd go down a hillside and go across the valley, by the time they got up that other hill, the oryx would now be on the next hill over. And so they never got a real good look at it, and very few people successfully hunted the oryx, the Arabian oryx, until about the middle of the 1900s. Now, during that time, there were a lot of wars across the world, notably World War II. That introduced armies with big trucks and jeeps into a lot of places where those things didn't exist before. And with that, it also brought guns. Now, after World War II, many parts of the Middle East were explored for oil, because as humans, we wanted ways to gain more energy. And oil, which can be turned into gasoline, is one of those great ways that we had exploited to find energy. And with that exploration of oil came guns and off-road vehicles. And so all these people who lived in that area, who had revered these animals and felt it was a sacred honor to hunt this beautiful creature for thousands of years, now suddenly had the ability to do that much, much easier. And they could do that very quickly. And so what was, at one point, you might hunt and successfully kill one oryx in your lifetime, became you could hunt and kill 10 or 12 in a day. And so the oryx drastically started to disappear from the Middle East. And there was a group of scientists in England who had been watching this. They were studying endangered species around the planet, and they got together and said, hey, if we don't help this Arabian oryx out, it's gonna be extinct really soon. And that was in the 1960s. And so they started a plan to capture some oryx and to bring them into a zoo setting and breed them to try to save that species before it disappeared entirely. And so with that, they went and they started looking for oryx out in the wild in the Middle East. And during that time, they only found a few individuals, 3. They found 3 in the wild. They got 4 more from the Saudi Arabian king, 2 males and 2 females from him. They got a female from the London Zoo, and they got a female from a sheikh in Kuwait. So together, that's 9 animals. And that's all that was left. And they took them to the Phoenix Zoo in Arizona because the climate was right. The Phoenix Zoo was brand new at that time. It had just barely opened. And they were given this huge challenge to save this species. And, sorry, I'm passionate about this. It gets me. They were able to save them. And that's what zoos do. They save species from extinction. And that's what the Phoenix Zoo did with the Arabian oryx. And over the years, they started to share those babies with other zoos. And all those zoos started to mix their babies together and breed them. And so over the next 20 years, from the 1960s through the 1980s, they were able to create a population of several hundred. And after that was the case, in 1981, let me back up. In 1972, they were officially declared extinct in the wild. They had looked for 3 years and couldn't find any more. And in 1981, they took oryx back to Oman, which is a little country in the Middle East, and they released them back to the wild. Sorry. Whew. Today, there's over 7,000 oryx, Arabian oryx, out in the wild, or globally. That's the global population. I have some photos that I'll put up of them. And when you look at these photos, I want you to look at the animal and see how it matches the myth of the unicorn. Particularly when they stand sideways. They have two very long, skinny horns that come back off of their head. But when they stand sideways, those horns line up and it looks like one horn. And from a far distance, this magical animal that you can't tell if it's a horse or if it's a goat, this white animal with one horn, looks very much like much of the art that the unicorn is based on. Now, the Arabian oryx has a cousin, and that cousin is called the scimitar horned oryx. And very similar story, although its disappearance from the wild was much, much, much more recently. And they were officially declared extinct in the wild in the 1990s. And they were just reintroduced back to the wild within the last 5 years. And an organization called the Sahara Conservation Fund had pointed that. We talked about them a little bit with the ostrich critter chat a couple of days ago. One of my friends who's a veterinarian at a zoo in Texas called Fossil Rim Wildlife Center is actually one of the field veterinarians for these released animals. And several times a year, she has been able to go over to Africa, to the country of Chad, where they are reintroducing the scimitar horned oryx. They also got down to being totally wiped out in the wild, with only a population left in zoos. Again, zoos saving species. That's how it works. I'll be putting up some information about both those species of oryx later on the Facebook profile. So that kind of takes care of our early myths of unicorns from India and from the Middle East. But what about those myths coming out of China and Japan? They also had myths about a magical creature with a single horn. And the early art piece that I found that looks like that kind of resembled a goat-like, horse-like creature with one horn. Well, and the science community didn't know what that meant for a long time. Yeah, it could be the rhinos. Rhinos are not far from that. But there was another creature. Science didn't even know about this creature until May of 1992. That's in my lifetime, when they discovered a new kind of animal, a big animal that weighs about 200 pounds, who lives in the forested mountains of Vietnam. And that animal is called the Saola. And that animal also has two horns, big, long, skinny horns that can be 20 inches long that come off the back of its head. But when that animal stands sideways, those horns line up and it looks like one horn. Now, these animals are very rare. Not much is known about them. Science has only known about them for, 28 years now. And we're still learning a lot about the Saola. They also only think that there's 200 of them left. Now, there were never that many to begin with because they live in a very isolated area of mountains on the border between Vietnam and Laos. And they're considered critically endangered. with their biggest threats being habitat loss as the forests are cut down to grow crops, and also poaching, mostly set by snares that are set to catch food for people living in the areas. But a snare catches a lot of different animals, whether that's the kind of animal they're trying to catch to eat or not. I'll be posting some great information about the Saola later on today on the Facebook profile. So that takes care of our China and Japan myth of the unicorn. That's pretty close to China. China and Vietnam are borders, and that kind of sums up that. But wait, we have one more piece. What about this king in Denmark? What about his throne made of unicorn horns? I've seen pictures of the throne. The throne has horns this big around. With the exception of the rhino, nothing else looks like these horns. The horns on an oryx are only like this. The horns on a Saola are the same size. These big horns that his throne's made out of, where did they come from? What are they? There's another animal. It's the unicorn of the sea, the narwhal. You've probably seen cartoons or drawings. You may have seen photos or videos of it. But a male narwhal has 2 teeth. And early on in his life, his more prominent tooth, because I guess they have that, starts to grow through his front lip. And that tooth becomes a tusk. And that tusk gets to 10 feet in length. Now, a narwhal's a pretty good sized animal. It's like a supersized dolphin. They can be about 20 feet long, and they can weigh about 4,000 pounds. And this tusk can grow an additional 10 feet in front of them. And scientists still aren't really sure what the narwhal uses its tusks for, but they have them, they exist, and they're well known. Narwhals live in the Arctic Ocean, so that's kind of around the globe. They live above Canada, through some of the waterways of Canada, around Alaska, Russia, and Norway. Norway is the neighboring country of Denmark. And this king, back in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance in Denmark, got his throne made from unicorn horns from narwhals. How do we know that? The throne's still around. They've done DNA tests on the horns. They figured out that they're narwhals. So I present to you 4 different species that are all part of the unicorn legend. Rhinos, oryx, Saola, narwhals. Now there's some other unicorns out there, and those are animals that have single horns, but they didn't really contribute to the myth. They were actually named after the unicorn. And there's a great fish that I get to see when I work at the aquarium called a unicorn fish. It has a little horn right on the front of its head. It's only about this big, but the fish is only like this. And unicorn fish have this magical horn that no one really knows what it does. We don't know why it's there. It's part of the fascination of science, is that we still are learning. There's another animal called a chameleon. That's a unicorn chameleon that also has a little horn on the front of its head. Don't know what that's for. So although the unicorn image that I shared earlier today, that's fake. That's exaggeration. That's artist creative interpretation of what a unicorn may be. But unicorns definitely have some roots in some actual real animals. Join me on the Facebook profile later today. I have some really great images I'll be sharing very soon of these different species we've talked about in today's Critter Chat. I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today. I hope you've enjoyed learning about unicorns. Sorry I got emotional. I get passionate about saving wildlife. And it's because it's something I've dedicated my life to doing. And although that road is not always easy, it's something I care very greatly about. And I believe that zoos and aquariums do a really great job of helping that along. And things like the oryx are examples of that. Rhinos too. So that concludes our Critter Chat for today. Feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and share this information with anyone else you might think would enjoy it. Full episodes will be uploaded later today on Facebook and YouTube. Yesterday I had some connection issues, so hopefully it goes a little smoother today. But they all get there eventually, for sure. So until tomorrow, take care of yourself, have fun, be safe. Oh, our special shout outs. So for the oryx species, I'm gonna give a special shout out to the Phoenix Zoo, who saved the Arabian oryx, and also to the Fossil Rim Wildlife Center, who's doing a lot with their cousins, the scimitar horned oryx, and also for the Saola, the SaveTheSaola.org. We already covered rhinos in a whole different episode, so feel free to go back to that. Our special shout out there was the International Rhino Foundation. And narwhals, believe it or not, they are near threatened. There's 80,000 of them out there. They do have some risks. That's humans developing things for oil and drilling and causing problems like climate change, which we've covered. But yeah, humans could do better. Humans can do more. Till tomorrow, have fun, take care of yourself, stay safe, be happy. See you later.